No one in that room expected an 85-year-old woman to stand her ground, not after the way her nephews had been treating her, not after the cold looks, the whispered comments, the rushed signatures they tried to force into her trembling hands. But there she was, Aunt Helen, sitting alone at the end of a long conference table, her thin fingers gripping the arms of the chair as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. Her nephews stood over her, impatient, annoyed, acting like they were doing her a favor just by showing up. "Come on, Aunt Helen," Mark said, sliding a stack of documents toward her. "You're making this harder than it needs to be. Just sign. We'll handle everything from here." "Yeah," Daniel added, crossing his arms. "You don't even use the house anymore. What's the point of keeping it? It's time to be practical." Practical. That word hit her like a slap. Is that what she had become to them? A problem to be solved? Something to handle? Her voice shook. "This is my home we're talking about. Your uncle and I." "Uncle Ray is gone," Daniel cut in. "And you can't live there alone. You know that." She looked at them. 2 grown men she helped raise, 2 boys she once fed at her kitchen table while their parents worked long shifts. She remembered the summers they spent in her backyard, running through the sprinkler, chasing fireflies, falling asleep on the couch with bowls of ice cream melting in their hands. But the men standing in front of her weren't those boys anymore. "Aunt Helen," Mark said, leaning in, lowering his voice so it sounded almost gentle, "we're not trying to hurt you. We just don't want things to get complicated. If you sign these papers now, we can take care of the estate without involving anything else. No courts, no mess. Simple." Simple. To them it was simple. Get rid of the old woman. Sell the house. Split the money. She swallowed hard. "And what happens to me?" Silence. Not even a fake reassurance. Not even a lie. Just silence. She felt her chest tighten. Her breath shortened. The room around her seemed to shrink. Her nephews exchanged glances, irritated, waiting for her to finally give up. "You've become a burden." That's what their eyes said. A weight, an inconvenience. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered. "Because we have our own lives," Daniel said. "We can't keep running after you." Running after her. She barely asked for anything. A ride to the doctor once a month, a grocery trip on Sundays, a phone call here and there. But to them, that was too much. The attorney, Mr. Callahan, stood by the bookshelf, watching the entire scene with a tight jaw. He had invited everyone to the office that afternoon for the reading of Uncle Ray's will, but the nephews arrived early, hoping to take care of everything before the official meeting began. They didn't know what was coming. They didn't know what was written. They didn't know the truth Ray had left behind. Aunt Helen tried to steady her breathing. Her voice trembled like a dry leaf. "Ray didn't want this. He trusted you boys. He believed in you." "Well, Ray isn't here," Mark said, tapping the papers again. "Let's make this fast." But before she could say another word, the door opened. "Everyone," Mr. Callahan said, "it's time." The nephews straightened. Aunt Helen clutched the edge of the table. Something inside her, small, fragile, but still burning, told her that she needed to hold on just a little longer. Everyone took their seats. The attorney opened the folder, and the room fell into a heavy silence. You could hear the soft hum of the air conditioner, the scratching of the attorney's fingers on the paper, the faint creak of Helen's chair as she shifted, trying to calm the storm inside her chest. Then Mr. Callahan began reading. "I, Raymond Mitchell, being of sound mind and strong intention, leave the entirety of my estate." The nephews leaned forward. "To the one person who never once abandoned me, never once treated me as a burden, and never once asked for anything in return." The nephews exchanged confused looks. "To my wife, Helen Mitchell." Aunt Helen felt her heart stop for a moment. But the attorney wasn't finished. And should she be pressured, manipulated, or coerced by any party, notably my nephews Mark and Daniel Mitchell, "my secondary instructions are to be enacted without hesitation." "What?" Daniel blurted. "What secondary instructions?" Mr. Callahan continued, unfazed. "In the event any attempt is made to remove Helen from her home or force her to sign documents against her well-being, The property and all remaining assets shall be transferred to—" Mark sat up straight, breath held. "The Mitchell Senior Care Foundation, a community program created in Helen's name, dedicated to supporting elderly residents in Ohio who are alone or neglected by family." The air cracked like thunder. "What?" both nephews shouted. Aunt Helen's lips parted, stunned. The attorney closed the folder. "Ray suspected this might happen, and he made sure you wouldn't get away with it." The nephews were speechless, their faces twisted in shock, anger, disbelief. Aunt Helen's eyes filled with tears, not because of the money, not because of the house, but because her husband, even after death, had protected her in a way she didn't know she still mattered. And now, staring at her nephews, men she once loved like her own, she asked herself, how did we get here? How do boys who once cried in her arms grow into men capable of discarding her like a problem? If you've ever wondered how a family reaches a moment like this, stay with me, because what happened before that day explains everything. Before we continue, if this opening moved you even a little, make sure to stay with me until the very end of this story. It's one of the most powerful journeys you'll hear today. Long before anyone called her Aunt Helen, she was just Helen Brooks, a quiet girl who grew up on the outskirts of Dayton, Ohio. Her family lived in a small, drafty house on Maple Street, the kind with creaky wooden floors and windows that whistled in the winter. Money was always tight, but there was warmth in the home, warmth that came from her mother's soft laugh and her father's steady hands. Helen was the youngest of three. Her older brothers, Tom and Gerald, treated her like a fragile treasure. They helped her with homework, walked her to the school bus on icy mornings, and cheered for her louder than anyone when she learned how to ride a bike. They made her feel protected, even when life around them wasn't easy. Her mother worked as a seamstress in a local shop. Her father delivered furniture for a small warehouse. They didn't have much, but they lived simply, gratefully, without complaint. That was something Helen carried with her forever. The belief that life didn't need to be grand to be meaningful. When she was 19, she took a job at a small diner off Route 35. It was the kind of place where truckers stopped for breakfast at 5 a.m. Families came after church, and regulars sat in the same booth every day. Helen loved it there far more than she expected. She loved the smell of fresh coffee, the clatter of plates, the soft murmur of conversations, and the comfort of routine. And that was where she met Raymond Mitchell. Ray wasn't the kind of man who walked in with noise or confidence. He stepped into rooms like someone entering a church, quiet, observant, respectful. He worked at the local auto plant, often stopping by the diner after his shift for pie and a cup of decaf. At first, he barely spoke more than a polite, "Thank you," but over time, he began to linger. He asked about her day. He noticed when she cut her hair. He once brought her a small paper bag with a blueberry muffin, "because you said you liked them, and the store near my place makes good ones." He wasn't flashy. He wasn't loud. But his kindness was steady, genuine, the kind that stays. Helen fell for him slowly, in a way that crept into her life until one day she realized she couldn't imagine not seeing him. They married 2 years later in a modest church ceremony. There was no extravagance, just close family. A simple white dress, and Ray standing at the altar with nervous hands and the softest smile she had ever seen. They bought a small house in Cedar Falls, Ohio, the house that would later become the center of everything: memories, struggles, love, and eventually, conflict with the nephews. The house Ray fought to protect even after his death. Helen loved that home from the moment she walked in. The living room had a brick fireplace. The porch looked out onto the street where kids rode their bikes every afternoon. And the kitchen, oh the kitchen, smelled like mornings full of coffee, toast, and Ray humming old country songs he learned from his father. They dreamed of having children, but life had other plans. After years of trying, doctors told them it wouldn't happen. For some, that news crushes everything. For Helen and Ray, it simply redirected their love. They found family in other ways, with neighbors, with church members, and especially with their nephews, Mark and Daniel. The boy's mother, Ray's sister, struggled for many years with unstable relationships and financial trouble. She often left the boys with Helen and Ray, sometimes for days at a time, and Helen took them in as if they were her own. She braided Mark's hair when he was little. She taught Daniel how to tie his shoelaces. She read them stories at night and sat beside them at the kitchen table while they did homework. They felt like the children she never had. Time passed, and Helen and Ray lived quietly, simply. They weren't wealthy, but they were generous. They helped neighbors fix broken fences. They volunteered at church events. They hosted holiday dinners even when money was tight, because no one should spend Christmas alone, Helen always said. She didn't know then that decades later, those same holidays would be spent in painful silence. Ray kept working at the auto plant until he retired. Helen continued at the diner until her knees began to ache and her doctor told her to slow down. Their life together was marked by small joys, garden tomatoes, Sunday drives, old photo albums spread across the living room floor. But the greatest joy was watching Mark and Daniel grow. The boys practically lived at their house during the summers. Ray taught them how to fish at the lake behind Miller's farm. Helen showed them how to bake peanut butter cookies. On the 4th of July, they sat on the porch and watched the neighbors set off fireworks. On Christmas mornings, the boys ran into their living room before daylight, opening presents that Helen and Ray could barely afford, but saved for all year. Everyone assumed that one day, when Helen and Ray were gone, the house would naturally go to the nephews. Not because of law, but because of love. But that kind of assumption only works when love is returned. When Helen looked back at those days, she remembered the softness first, the boys laughing in the backyard, Ray waving from the porch, the smell of laundry drying in the Ohio sun. But beneath those warm memories lived something she never expected to confront, the realization that the boys who once clung to her apron strings would later treat her like a burden. It didn't happen overnight. It began slowly, a missed Thanksgiving, a forgotten birthday, short visits, long silences. Then, over the years, a shift, a distance, a subtle calculation in their eyes whenever she mentioned the house, or the property taxes, or the difficulty of keeping up with maintenance. They still called her Aunt Helen, but something in the tone had changed, a soft impatience, a layer of coldness she pretended not to notice. She didn't know then, but those quiet changes were the seeds of everything that would explode later. The pressure, the manipulation, the attempt to strip her of the home she built with Ray. But before all that pain, before the humiliation, before the confrontation in that attorney's office, there was a life full of meaning, sacrifice, and love. An understanding that past is what makes everything that came later hurt so deeply. If you're still here, stay with me. The next part shows the sacrifices Helen made for the very boys who would one day try to erase her. Helen never considered herself extraordinary. She didn't think her life was special or remarkable. She believed she was just a woman who loved her husband, loved her home, and loved the two boys who grew up under her roof as if they were her own. But if you looked closely at her life, you would see the sacrifices she made in silence, the little choices, the quiet struggles, the way she gave and gave without ever keeping score. After Ray retired from the auto plant, money became tighter. The pension helped, but not enough to cover everything. Helen started cleaning houses twice a week to make ends meet. She never told Mark or Daniel about it. She didn't want them to see her as someone who needed help. She always wanted to be the one giving help, not asking for it. She would walk down Cedar Lane with her cleaning bucket, smiling at neighbors who waved from porches or front yards. Inside each house she cleaned, she moved carefully, dusting shelves filled with framed photos, wiping down counters that smelled of lemon and lavender. Sometimes homeowners offered her water or a cookie, and she always accepted with gratitude, even when her feet ached and her back pulsed with pain. She never complained, not once. Because every dollar she earned meant she and Ray could keep their home, the same home where the nephews slept on the living room rug, the same home where she made pancakes on Saturday mornings and tucked blankets around two little boys on nights when storms rattled the windows. And when the boys needed anything, clothes, school supplies, camp fees, last-minute groceries, Helen and Ray always found a way. Ray would collect small repair jobs around the neighborhood, fixing fences, tightening door hinges, replacing porch boards, mowing lawns for old neighbors who couldn't anymore. He brought home the cash in a folded envelope, and Helen stored it in a jar above the fridge labeled, "For the boys." There were months when the jar held less than $10. There were months when it was full. But regardless of the amount, the commitment never changed. One winter, Mark needed braces. His mother couldn't afford them. Helen quietly sold her wedding china, the only fancy possession she had. Ray sold his old collection of rare auto magazines. Together, they covered the cost. Neither of the boys ever knew how the bill got paid. Another year, Daniel wanted to join a summer baseball league. The fee was expensive. Helen cleaned 3 extra houses that month, pushing herself through knee pain so sharp it made her breath catch. She hid her swollen joints under long skirts. She cooked dinner standing on one foot to ease the pressure. But when Daniel ran into her house waving the permission slip and saying, "I made the team," her tiredness evaporated. Moments like that made every sacrifice feel small. Neighbors often asked why Helen went to such lengths. She always answered the same way. They're good boys. They just need someone who believes in them. She never believed love should be measured by what you get back. But life has a way of wearing down even the strongest hearts. As the boys grew older, their visits became shorter. Holidays turned into quick drop-ins. Thanksgiving dinners became phone calls. Then, eventually, texts. Simple messages. Short, rushed. "Merry Christmas, Aunt Helen. Happy birthday. Hope you're doing okay." She held on to those messages longer than you might think. She would print them out sometimes and set them on the kitchen table, reading them again on quiet afternoons when she missed the sound of their voices. She tried not to blame them for being busy. Life pulls people away. Careers, relationships, responsibilities. She understood. She excused it. She forgave it. But the distance grew. Subtle at first, then unmistakable. One summer she called Daniel to ask if he could stop by to help fix the fence. He said he would try. He didn't come. When she called again, he apologized but said work had been overwhelming. She said she understood. She told him not to worry. She fixed the fence herself. Another year Mark promised to spend Christmas Eve with her and Ray. But on the morning of the 24th, he sent a message saying plans had changed. Something came up. He didn't explain what. Helen and Ray sat at their table that night, 2 plates of food untouched, listening to the ticking of the kitchen clock. Ray stared at the snow falling outside the window. Quiet in a way Helen wasn't used to. She reached for his hand. He squeezed hers, but the ache stayed in his eyes. Still, Helen held on to hope. She always believed the boys would come back, that the warmth of childhood memories would eventually pull them close again. But time shifts people. It hardens some. It confuses others. It distorts what once felt simple. Helen noticed a particular change the year after Ray passed away. Mark and Daniel began asking more questions about the house. At first, she didn't think much of it. Maybe they were worried about the property taxes or her ability to maintain it, but the tone was different, sharper, less caring, more calculated. "Have you thought about downsizing? Do you really need such a big house? It's a lot of work for someone your age." She brushed the comments aside. But when they began asking about her finances, about her insurance, about whether the house was fully paid off, she felt something shift inside her chest. A quiet alarm, a warning she tried to ignore, because these were the boys she had raised with her own hands, boys she would have given anything for. She never stopped loving them, but it was getting harder not to feel the distance, harder not to feel the coldness behind their questions. Little did she know, those questions were only the beginning, that the real intentions would reveal themselves in a way she never expected, that the house she fought to keep would become the tool they used against her. But before that betrayal came, there was still a deep, unwavering truth about Helen's life. She gave more than she ever received. She loved without asking for anything in return, and she believed family meant loyalty, no matter how imperfect. That belief, however, would soon be tested in the harshest way. Before everything fell apart, before the first cruel attempt to corner her, there was still one more chapter of her life with Ray that shaped everything that followed, their bond, their quiet routines, their reliance on each other as the years layered themselves like fading seasons. And that is where this story turns next. As the years went by, Mark and Daniel stepped into adulthood with an ambition neither Helen nor Ray had ever expected. The boys who once chased fireflies in their backyard now carried briefcases, wore polished shoes, and spoke with confidence about careers, promotions, and opportunities far beyond the quiet streets of Cedar Falls. Mark was the first to leave Ohio. He got a job offer in Chicago after college, a place buzzing with noise, movement, and opportunities. Helen remembered the day he told her. They were sitting at her kitchen table, just like old times. She had made him a sandwich the way he liked, turkey, pickles, mustard, but he barely touched it. "I won't be able to come back often," he said, not looking up from his phone. "Chicago's fast-paced. It's what I need right now." Helen nodded, her smile soft but sincere. "I'm proud of you, sweetheart. Really. I always knew you would go far." He hugged her before leaving, but the hug was quick, distracted, as if his mind was already halfway out the door. Daniel stayed in Ohio, but only by convenience. He worked in Columbus as a property manager and often talked about big plans, big deals, and big clients. He had developed a businessman's swagger, the kind of confidence that made people stop and listen, even when he wasn't saying much. He visited Helen occasionally at first, but the visits grew shorter. His phone never stopped ringing. He was always rushing, always late, always promising he'd come by next week. Next week rarely came. Helen tried not to take it personally. She knew life could pull people into its current like a fast-moving river. She didn't want to be a burden. She didn't want to slow them down. She wanted them to succeed, but the distance hurt, not because she needed help, but because she missed the boys she had raised. After Ray died, the absence felt even heavier. The house felt bigger, quieter, colder. Helen might have reached out more, but grief made her smaller. Days blended together. Nights felt longer. The porch creaked louder without Ray stepping on it. The kitchen felt empty without his humming. The radio stations he loved sounded too quiet. She needed family more than ever. But the boys seemed further than ever. The first real sign of change came 6 months after the funeral. Daniel arrived one afternoon with a notebook and a folder under his arm. He hugged her quickly, glanced around the house as if evaluating it, and sat at the kitchen table before she even had the chance to offer him tea. "Aunt Helen," he said, flipping open the notebook, "we need to talk about your situation." "My situation?" she asked, confused. "Yeah, you're alone here. It's a lot to manage, and the property taxes are going to keep going up." She didn't respond. She just listened, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "I've been looking into some options," he continued. "You could move into assisted living. They take care of everything. Meals, medication, laundry, and you wouldn't have to worry about the house anymore." "The house isn't a worry," she said gently. "It's home." Daniel pressed his lips together. "You're being sentimental. This place is too big for you." She looked around. The pictures on the walls, the armchair Ray used to sit in, the curtains she had sewn herself, the faint smell of lemon from her morning cleaning. Everything familiar, everything safe. "It doesn't feel too big," she said softly. "It should," he replied. After that conversation, Daniel began calling more often, but never to ask how she was. His questions were always about finances, utilities, the roof, the furnace, the taxes. Always numbers, always concerns that weren't his to manage. Mark, from Chicago, joined the chorus through short, clipped phone calls. "You should sell the house, Aunt Helen. The market's great right now. You could use the money to make things easier for yourself. Daniel and I can walk you through the process." Each call chipped away at her peace. She began to dread the sound of her phone ringing. She wondered if they saw her as a person or a project. One Sunday afternoon, something happened that she never forgot. She had spent the morning tending to her garden. The sun was warm, but her back ached more than usual. She took it slow, pulling weeds, watering tomato plants, trimming the hydrangeas Ray had planted years earlier. Afterward, she made herself a cup of tea and sat on the porch, resting her hands in her lap. That was when a car pulled up in front of the house. Daniel stepped out, wearing sunglasses and a pressed shirt, carrying the same folder he'd brought before. "You're doing yard work alone?" he asked, as if she'd committed a crime. "I enjoy it," she said. "It keeps me moving." "You shouldn't be doing this kind of stuff. What if you fall? What if you hurt yourself? This is exactly why you shouldn't be living here." He walked past her into the house without waiting for an invitation. She followed him slowly. Inside, he placed his folder on the kitchen table and began speaking as if rehearsed. "We found a place for you. It's a senior community near Columbus. Meals included, transportation included, medical staff on site. It's a good deal." She shook her head gently. "Daniel, I'm not ready to leave. It's not about being ready. It's about being practical." There was that word again. Practical. He opened his folder and pulled out a few printed photos. Images of modern buildings, rooms with plain furniture, smiling staff members. Helen stared at the pictures, feeling a tightness forming in her chest. "This isn't my home," she said quietly. Daniel sighed, frustrated. "You're not thinking long term." Long term. She was 85. Her long term was today. Her long term was the memory of Ray's hand on hers. Her long term was the porch, the garden, the kitchen radio, the quiet mornings she cherished. But Daniel couldn't see that. Or maybe he didn't want to. The pressure escalated from there. Little comments, subtle hints, more calls, more folders, more conversations that felt like interrogations, until one day the concern they pretended to have finally revealed itself for what it really was. Daniel mentioned the value of the house. Mark mentioned splitting responsibilities. Both of them brought up money. Not her comfort, not her safety, not her happiness. Money. Helen felt something inside her shift, a quiet breaking, a fracture only she could feel. The boys she had raised, the boys she had sacrificed for, the boys she had loved without limit, now seemed to be circling her home like vultures, circling a single piece of meat. They weren't asking anymore. They were deciding. And soon, they would take that one step too far, the step that would lead her into the attorney's office, the humiliation, the betrayal, and the truth Ray had left behind to protect her. Everything was already in motion. But Helen didn't know that yet. She still believed she could reason with them. She still believed they loved her the way she loved them. She still believed this wasn't about the house. She didn't know how wrong she was. Helen had always been someone who believed in giving people the benefit of the doubt. She assumed misunderstandings could be cleared up with a calm conversation. She assumed love, even when thin and stretched, could still hold a family together. And she assumed the boys she raised, the boys she cherished, still carried a piece of that childhood warmth somewhere inside them. But something about the last few interactions lingered inside her like a weight she could not set down. For weeks, she tried to shake off the uneasy feeling. She kept herself busy with routines that gave her life meaning. She watered her garden in the early mornings when dew still clung to the tomato leaves. She listened to the old country station on her kitchen radio while folding laundry the way Ray used to. She swept the porch every Thursday afternoon, even if it wasn't dirty. Routine kept her grounded. Routine made her feel safe. Routine helped her pretend things were still the way they used to be. But each evening when she sat at the small round table and ate dinner by herself, the quiet pressed in around her. It was a quiet that didn't comfort. It questioned. It forced her to sit with thoughts she didn't want to have. What if the boys weren't coming from a place of concern? What if they weren't thinking about her well-being at all? What if their urgency was about something else entirely? She hated herself for thinking that way. She hated the suspicion. She hated the idea that she might be right. 3 weeks after Daniel's last visit, she decided she couldn't sit in silence anymore. She needed to see them. She needed to understand what was happening. And she needed to do it before things took a turn she couldn't reverse. It started with a simple phone call. She dialed Daniel first. He answered on the third ring, out of breath. "Aunt Helen? Hey, I'm in the middle of something. Everything okay?" "Yes, sweetheart," she said, keeping her voice calm. "I was hoping to see you. Maybe we could sit and talk." "Talk? About what?" "Oh, just a few things on my mind." "Nothing serious." Daniel sighed into the phone. "Okay. Yeah, I guess I can fit you in? Fit her in. Like a meeting. Like a task. They agreed on Saturday afternoon. Next, she called Mark. He didn't pick up. She tried again later. Still nothing. She considered leaving a voicemail but decided against it. Mark would claim he was too busy, just like always. So she wrote him a short message instead, asking if they could meet on Saturday too. He replied hours later. Short, cold, busy day, maybe next weekend. But Helen knew next weekend would turn into the weekend after that, and then after that, just like all the other times. So she wrote back one more message. It's important. I need you and Daniel both here. He didn't answer, but she knew he saw it. Mark was the type who rarely missed a message, even when he ignored them. Saturday arrived heavy with anticipation. The morning sky was gray, thick with clouds, as if the weather itself sensed a shift coming. Helen made a small pot of coffee and placed 2 mugs on the counter, even though she wasn't sure either of the boys would take a cup. She cleaned the living room, dusted the shelves, straightened old framed photos, and opened the curtains to let in what little light the day had to offer. At exactly 2 p.m., a car pulled into the driveway. Daniel. He walked in with the same hurried energy he always had, holding his phone in one hand as if waiting for an excuse to step back out. "Where's Mark?" she asked quietly. "He said he can't come," Daniel replied. "Something came up." Helen nodded, though her heart dipped. "That's all right," she said. "We can talk now." Daniel sat at the kitchen table, arms crossed. "So," he said, "what's this about?" She took a deep breath. She had rehearsed this conversation in her head all week, but now that the moment was here, her voice felt small. "Daniel, I feel there's something you're not telling me." He blinked. "What are you talking about?" "All these questions about the house, about my finances, about where I should live." Her hands fidgeted with the hem of her sleeve. "I just need to know why you're pushing so hard." Daniel leaned back impatient. "Because it's obvious, Aunt Helen. You can't stay here forever. The house is old. You're alone. You shouldn't be doing yard work or climbing stairs or trying to keep this place together. We're trying to help." She studied his face. His tone didn't sound like help. It sounded like frustration, like inconvenience, like burden. "And the house?" she asked softly. "Why are you so concerned about that?" "Because it's an asset," he snapped. "It shouldn't sit here wasting away. You're sitting on something valuable and doing nothing with it." Her heart tightened. Doing nothing with it. That house was her life, her memories, her years with Ray, her heart. But Daniel wasn't finished. "We could manage the property, sell it, invest the money, use part of it for your care. It makes sense." "And Mark agrees?" she asked. "He does. He just didn't want to say it to your face." The silence that followed felt like a door closing. She swallowed. I didn't think I had become a burden to you boys." "You're not a burden," he said quickly. "You're just. That word alone was enough to break something inside her. You're just at a point where decisions need to be made," he finished. Decisions. Made by them. About her. Without her. Something inside her straightened then. A quiet spine of resolve. "Daniel," she said, voice firmer now. "I'm not signing anything. I'm not leaving my home." He stared at her as if she were the unreasonable one. "You're being sentimental," he said again. "No," she replied, surprising even herself. "I'm being honest. I'm not ready." He sighed, frustrated. "Well, Mark and I have been talking to someone about options. A lawyer who can help streamline things." A lawyer. That was the moment everything became clear. The pressure, the comments, the urgency. It was never about her well-being. It was about control, about the house, about money. Always money. Her voice trembled. "Daniel, why would you talk to a lawyer without me?" "Because," he said, "we need to protect the family assets." Family assets. As if she were no longer part of that family. As if her home, her memories, her life, were pieces in an equation he needed to balance. She folded her hands to steady the shake. "Ray trusted you boys." Daniel shifted, looking away. "Well, Ray's not here anymore." The words hit her like a cold wind. That was the moment she felt something change inside her, something small but powerful, a spark of clarity, a light she hadn't felt in months. She needed answers, she needed truth, and she needed to understand what Ray had left behind in his will. She stood up. "I think it's time I speak with Mr. Callahan." Daniel frowned. "Why?" "Because," she said with a calmness he didn't expect, "I want to know exactly what Ray wanted." Daniel's face stiffened. "Aunt Helen, that's not necessary." "Oh, I believe it is." For the first time in years she felt her own strength return. Quiet, steady, unshakable. She walked Daniel to the door. He stepped outside, frustrated, but didn't turn back. Helen closed the door behind him, leaned against it, and exhaled. She didn't know what the will said. She didn't know what Ray had prepared, but she knew she needed to find out. Before Mark and Daniel tried to take everything away, that night she made a decision. She would visit the attorney, she would ask questions, she would protect her home, and she would not let the boys bully her into anything ever again. The next chapter of her life had already begun. Helen didn't sleep well the night before the meeting with the attorney. She woke up several times, each time with the same heaviness in her chest, the same fear whispering in her ear. She pushed it away, reminding herself that Ray had always planned ahead. He had been careful, thoughtful, and deeply protective. If there was something she needed to know, he would have left it somewhere she could find it. Still, the uneasiness remained. She made herself breakfast but barely ate. The toast cooled untouched on her plate. The coffee tasted bitter no matter how much sugar she added. Her hands trembled slightly as she washed the dishes. By the time she arrived at Mr. Callahan's office, she was exhausted from worry alone. The attorney greeted her warmly. "Helen, I didn't expect you today. Come in." She stepped inside, swallowing the nerves that rose in her throat. "I hope I'm not intruding," she said. I needed to ask a few questions." "Of course," he said, guiding her to a chair. "Anything you need." Just as she was about to speak, the front door opened behind her. Two voices entered the office, voices she knew well, Mark and Daniel. She stiffened. The attorney's eyes flicked toward them, surprised. Neither nephew showed surprise at seeing her. Instead, they exchanged a quick glance, the kind that said something had been planned long before she arrived. "Helen," Mark said, "you should have told us you were coming." "I didn't know I had to," she replied, keeping her voice steady. Daniel walked past her to the table, his expression sharp. "We wanted to handle this before things got harder." "Harder for who?" she asked. "For everyone," he said simply. Mr. Callahan raised a hand. "Let's all sit down. There's no need for tension." Helen sat, but her heart was pounding. Mark took the chair to her left. Daniel sat to her right. She suddenly felt smaller, boxed in. The attorney opened a file, but before he could speak, Daniel cut in. "Helen, we need to be honest here. You can't live alone anymore. You're not well." She blinked, stunned. "Not well? What do you mean?" "You forget things," Daniel said. "You're fragile. It's not safe." "I do not forget things," she replied, her voice trembling with the effort to remain composed. "You called me twice last week about the same issue," he snapped. "I called you because the furnace was making a noise," she said softly. "And I told you to call a repairman," he said, dismissing her. "But instead you called me again. That's not normal." Her cheeks warmed with embarrassment. It hadn't been confusion. It had been loneliness. She had wanted to hear his voice. She had hoped he might come. But he didn't know that. Or he didn't care. Mark added, "We're trying to help you, Aunt Helen, but you're making this really difficult." "Difficult?" she whispered. "By wanting to stay in my home?" Mark leaned in, lowering his voice as if explaining something to a child. "You are 85. You can't keep pretending you're the same woman you were 10 years ago. You need a facility, a place with supervision." Supervision. As if she were incapable. As if she were a burden too risky to handle. Her throat tightened. "I'm not pretending anything. I can still take care of myself." Daniel scoffed. "Barely." The attorney cleared his throat. "Gentlemen, let's maintain respect." But the nephews had already crossed a line. Mark slid a document across the table. This is the preliminary agreement for the sale of the house. We found a buyer. All you need to do is sign here, here, and here." Helen stared at the papers, her name printed in neat black ink, her home reduced to numbers, percentages, and signatures. "You already found a buyer?" she asked, shocked. "We're trying to take the pressure off you," Daniel said. "You should be thanking us." Thanking them for dismantling her life, for tearing down the walls she built, for selling the place that held her happiest memories. Her voice shook. "You did this behind my back." "No," Mark said. "We did this for you." She pushed the papers back toward them. "I'm not signing." Daniel's tone sharpened. "Helen, stop acting emotional. You don't understand how serious this is." The humiliation settled on her like a weight she couldn't lift. Acting emotional, not understanding, not capable. Her eyes filled, but she refused to let tears fall. She kept her chin up, her hands trembling in her lap. "Your uncle trusted you," she whispered. "He believed you would take care of me." Mark's expression hardened. "Well, he's gone, and we're the only ones left who know what needs to be done." Helen inhaled sharply. It felt like the air had been pulled from the room. She tried to find her voice, but her heart was beating so loudly she could barely hear her own thoughts. The attorney stepped in. "These decisions are Helen's alone. No one can make her sign anything." Daniel turned to him sharply. "We're trying to prevent a disaster. She can't maintain the house. She's vulnerable. This is about her safety." "No," Helen said quietly. "This is about the house." Daniel's jaw clenched. "Fine, if that's how you want to see it." He gathered the papers with a frustrated snap. Mark added, "You're making a mistake. One day you'll realize that." The attorney raised a hand. "That's enough." But the damage was done. Helen felt exposed, stripped, belittled, not because they wanted her to move, but because of the way they did it. Cold, calculated, without love. For the first time in her life, she felt like the boys she raised didn't see her as family anymore, just an obstacle. She rose slowly from her chair. The attorney asked gently, "Helen, would you like to step outside for a moment?" She nodded. She walked to the hallway, her legs unsteady, her breath shallow. She placed her hand on the wall to hold herself up. She had never felt so small, so dismissed, so unwanted. Behind her, she heard the nephews speaking in low, irritated tones to the attorney. She heard anger. She heard annoyance. She heard entitlement. But she didn't hear love, not even a trace. And that was the moment something in her heart cracked for good. Eventually, the attorney called her back in. He informed everyone that the formal reading of Ray's will would take place the following week. Neither nephew seemed concerned. They thought they knew what was coming. They thought this was the final step in getting what they wanted. But Ray had seen this coming long before they did, and the truth he left behind would change everything. Helen walked out of the attorney's office that day with a heaviness she could feel all the way down to her bones. She stood on the sidewalk for several minutes, her hands trembling slightly, her breath unsettled. Cars passed by, people walked in and out of buildings. A gust of wind swept across the street, but she felt disconnected from all of it. It wasn't simply that the boys had pressured her. It wasn't even that they had tried to manipulate her into signing papers. It was the tone, the coldness, the way they spoke to her as if she were incapable, inconvenient, and irrational. She had raised them with patience, with sacrifice, with love she never once withheld. And now, in their eyes, she was someone to be corrected, managed, pushed aside. She slowly walked to the bus stop, not trusting herself to drive. She held her purse close to her chest, her breathing shallow. A young woman waiting beside her glanced at her with concern. "Are you okay, ma'am?" Helen forced a smile. "I'm fine, dear. Just a little tired." It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the truth either. When she got home, she walked through the front door and paused. The silence of the house felt different than usual. It wasn't peaceful. It wasn't comforting. It was a sharp reminder of everything she feared losing. She moved slowly through the living room, running her hand along the back of Ray's old armchair, the fabric worn from years of use. She stood there for a long moment, staring at it, remembering how he used to sit there every evening, reading the newspaper while she cooked dinner. She whispered, "Ray, I wish you were here." Her voice cracked on the last word. That night, Helen couldn't bring herself to cook. She warmed a can of soup on the stove and ate half of it before pushing the bowl away. Her appetite had vanished, replaced by a heavy knot of sadness. As she sat at the kitchen table, she heard a car pull into the driveway. Her heart jumped. For a moment she thought maybe, just maybe, one of the boys had come to apologize. But when she looked out the window, she saw Daniel stepping out of his car with a stiff expression on his face. She opened the door before he could knock. "Daniel?" she said softly. "What are you doing here?" He didn't waste time. He walked past her into the house, looking around as if searching for something out of place. "Aunt Helen, we need to talk. Now." She closed the door, her stomach tightening. "Daniel, I don't want another argument." It's not an argument," he said, though his tone carried nothing but frustration. "But you put us in a bad position today." "A bad position?" she repeated, stunned. "Yes," he insisted. "Mark and I are trying to do what's best, and you're making it impossible. You shouldn't have gone to the attorney without telling us." "I didn't know I had to ask your permission," she replied, struggling to keep her voice steady. Daniel exhaled sharply. "That's not the point." Then what is the point, Daniel?" she asked, finally looking him straight in the eyes. He hesitated, just long enough for the truth to slip through the cracks. "We can't move forward if you keep resisting us." "Move forward with what?" she asked quietly. "Taking my home?" His jaw tightened. "It's not your home anymore, Helen. It's a family asset, and you're putting its value at risk." The words hit her like a blow. "Not your home anymore." "Daniel." Her voice trembled. "Your uncle and I built our life here." "Exactly," he said coldly. "And now you can't manage it." She took a step back, her hand instinctively reaching for the wall behind her. "Is that what you really think of me? After everything?" Daniel looked away. "This isn't personal." "It feels very personal," she whispered. He rubbed his forehead, irritated. "Look, Mark and I talked to the attorney again after you left. We're going to move forward whether you cooperate or not. There are legal avenues for this." She stared at him, shocked. "Legal avenues? To take my home?" "To protect you," he insisted, though there was no warmth in his voice. "No," she said, her voice breaking. "This isn't about protecting me. It's about money." Daniel didn't deny it. He didn't confirm it either. He simply remained silent. And that silence was the loudest truth of all. Helen felt something crumble inside her. Not anger, not indignation, but heartbreak. The kind that leaves a person standing in the ruins of what they thought their family was. "I loved you boys," she said softly. "More than you'll ever know." Daniel looked uncomfortable, but he didn't reach for her. He didn't soften. He didn't say a single word that might ease her pain. He only said, "We'll talk again soon," and walked out the door. No hug, no reassurance, no kindness, just cold air rushing in as the door shut behind him. Helen stood alone in her living room, her breath trembling, her hands shaking, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. For the first time in her life, she felt truly abandoned. Not by strangers, not by time, but by the boys she raised, the boys she loved, the boys she would have given anything for. And in that moment, she knew something had broken between them, something that might never be repaired. Yet she also knew something else, something quiet but steady, rising from deep inside her. She wasn't going to let them take her home. She wasn't going to be bullied. She wasn't going to surrender everything she and Ray built. If they wanted a fight, she would show up, with dignity, with resolve, and with the truth Ray had left behind. This was no longer just about a house. This was about her life, and she would not let them erase it. The morning after Daniel's visit arrived colder than usual, even though the calendar insisted spring was just a week away. Helen woke before sunrise, her eyes heavy from a night spent tossing and turning. She sat up slowly, listening to the old house settle around her, its creaks and murmurs familiar in a way nothing else in her life felt anymore. For the first time in months, she didn't reach for the phone. She didn't worry about taxes. She didn't think about lawyers or signatures or what the boys might try next. Instead, she walked into the kitchen, opened the curtains, and let the early morning light spill across the counters. Dust danced in the beams of sunlight. The room felt soft again, lived in, hers. She brewed a fresh pot of coffee, breathing in the warm, comforting aroma. It reminded her of years when Ray would sit at the table reading the newspaper while she prepared breakfast. She'd give anything to hear him humming along to the radio just one more time. She poured her coffee and stepped outside onto the porch. The wood creaked under her feet, just like it always had. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and sank into the rocking chair. For the first time in a long while, she let herself simply exist. No pressure, no fear, just her, the morning air, and the house that still felt like the safest place in the world. She closed her eyes and whispered, "Ray, what do I do now?" The quiet answer came not in words, but in memory. A memory of him telling her, gently but firmly, "You don't let people take what you love. Not if you can fight for it." She opened her eyes, feeling a small shift inside her chest, a steadiness, a reminder of the strength she still carried, even if she had forgotten it. Later that afternoon she decided to take a walk, something she hadn't done in a while. She put on her coat, grabbed her purse, and stepped out into the neighborhood where she had lived most of her life. Cedar Falls had changed over the decades, but certain things hadn't. The wide sidewalks, the tall maple trees that lined the street, the faint smell of someone baking bread a few houses down. It felt like stepping into her own past. As she walked, she found herself gravitating toward a familiar house 3 blocks away. A small blue one-story home with a faded American flag on the porch. Mrs. Abrams lived there, a woman a few years younger than Helen, with a sharp wit and a heart big enough to fill a room. They used to talk all the time, on porches, over fences, during morning walks. But life had gotten quieter after Ray died, and Helen had slowly drifted into her own solitude. She hesitated on the sidewalk, unsure if she should knock. Before she could decide, the front door opened. "Helen?" Mrs. Abrams squinted, her hand shading her eyes. "Is that really you?" Helen couldn't help but smile. "It's me. I hope I'm not interrupting anything." "Interrupting? Nonsense! Get in here." Helen followed her inside, feeling warmth that had nothing to do with the heater. Mrs. Abrams led her to the kitchen, where a kettle was just beginning to whistle. "Sit," she said. "I'll make tea." The familiarity of it, the kindness, the routine, made something inside Helen soften. She hadn't realized how much she had missed this, the simple act of being welcomed. "So," Mrs. Abrams said as she placed a cup in front of her, "how have you been? I haven't seen you in ages." Helen wasn't sure where to start. She stared at the steam rising from her tea and finally let out a slow breath. "It's been hard," she admitted. "The boys have been pressuring me about the house." "Pressuring you?" Mrs. Abrams frowned. "In what way?" Helen told her the truth. The questions about her health, the pressure to move, the documents, the lawyer, the visit from Daniel, the coldness, the humiliation. When she finished, Mrs. Abrams shook her head slowly. "Helen, honey, that's not concern. That's greed." The bluntness of the words made Helen swallow hard. "I raised them," she whispered. "I never thought they would treat me this way." "Sometimes people forget who they were," Mrs. Abrams said, "especially when money gets involved. Doesn't make it right, doesn't make your pain any less real, but it's not your fault." Helen nodded, wiping the corner of her eye. Mrs. Abrams leaned forward. "And listen to me carefully. You are not alone. Not while I'm still breathing. If they try anything, you come to me. Understood?" The fierceness in her friend's voice sparked something in Helen. A reassurance, a reminder that she still mattered, at least to someone. After tea, Helen stayed for another hour, talking about lighter things. Gardens, church events, the new family that moved into the yellow house on Oak Street. Simple things, human things. The kind of conversation that began to stitch together pieces of her heart. When she finally walked home, she felt different. Lighter, stronger, still. When she stepped inside her house and closed the door behind her, the weight of what she faced returned. But this time it didn't crush her. It only reminded her of what she was fighting for. 2 days later, she visited Mr. Callahan again. This time she didn't walk in with fear. She walked in with purpose. "Mr. Callahan," she said as she sat across from him, "I need to know everything Ray arranged. I need to understand what he left behind." The attorney nodded, reached for a file, and slid it across the desk. "Helen," he said gently, "Ray anticipated many of the challenges you might face. He wanted to protect you." Her breath caught. He opened the file. Lines of text, instructions, provisions, safeguards, things she never knew Ray had prepared. He had seen the shift in the nephews long before she had. He had seen their growing interest in the house. He had seen their distance, their tone, their subtle entitlement, and he made sure they couldn't take advantage of her. When Helen left the attorney's office, she carried herself differently. Her shoulders were squared, her steps slower but steadier, her breath deep and controlled. She had clarity now. She had knowledge. And she had something even more powerful. She had resolve. That night, she baked cornbread the way Ray used to love, letting the warmth fill the kitchen. As she ate, she didn't think of what she had lost. She thought of what she was about to protect. Everything she and Ray had built. Everything the boys thought they could take. Everything she still held on to with quiet strength. Her fight wasn't over, but she was no longer afraid of it. This home still had one more battle in it, and so did she. The truth has a strange way of revealing itself. Sometimes it arrives softly, through a quiet realization. Other times it crashes into a person's life with enough force to knock the breath out of them. For Helen, it came little by little. A series of small events that, at first, felt unrelated. But once she began paying attention, truly paying attention, she saw the pattern that had been forming behind her back. It started the week after she visited the attorney for the second time. She needed a new furnace filter, something Ray always handled, so she called the local hardware store to ask if they still offered home delivery. The man on the phone hesitated. "Ma'am, didn't your nephew already cancel your account with us?" Helen blinked. "Cancel my account?" "Yes. A young man came in 2 weeks ago, said you didn't need the service anymore, and that all deliveries to your address should stop." Her pulse quickened. "What young man?" He said his name was Daniel. She thanked him and hung up, her hands trembling slightly. She walked into the living room and sank onto the couch. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. Canceling her account wasn't concern. It wasn't oversight. It was control. Later that same day, she received a letter from the electric company, an overdue notice. She frowned. She had paid that bill. She knew she had. She called the company, and after a short wait, a representative came on the line. "Yes, Mrs. Mitchell, your payment was received, but your auto pay was disabled by a relative who called in." "Disabled?" she repeated. "By who?" "Someone named Mark." Helen felt the room spin for a moment. None of this was accidental. None of this was harmless. They were cutting away her independence, piece by piece. When she hung up, she sat still for a long time, listening to the quiet hum of her refrigerator. She remembered the words Daniel had used. "You're forgetting things. You're not well." "Whoa, you're putting the house at risk." She realized then what they had been doing. They weren't just pressuring her into moving. They were trying to make her appear incapable. To others, to institutions, even to herself. A week later, the third piece of the puzzle fell into place. She walked to her mailbox on a crisp morning and found a notice from her insurance provider. It stated that her policy had been updated, downgraded actually, to a cheaper plan with fewer benefits. She called the company immediately. "Yes, Mrs. Mitchell," the woman said. "Your relative called and made the request." "Which relative?" "Mark Mitchell." Her voice trembled. "He doesn't have the authority to change my policy. He said he was handling your affairs." Handling your affairs. As if she had none of her own left. As if she had already been erased. Helen ended the call and pressed her hand to her forehead. A wave of dizziness washed over her. The truth now grew too large to ignore. They were setting the stage. They were creating a world where she appeared incompetent, helpless, unfit to manage her own life, because if she seemed incapable, on paper, in records, in the eyes of companies, then taking control of her home wouldn't just be easier, it would look justified. That afternoon she walked through her house slowly, touching the walls, the framed photos, the shelves Ray built himself. She whispered into the empty air, "They're trying to take everything from me." The realization didn't bring anger at first. It brought grief, not for the house, but for the boys she loved, for the trust she placed in them, for the years she spent believing their hearts were made of the same kindness she had poured into their childhoods. She sat down in Ray's armchair, the seat still shaped to the memory of his weight, and closed her eyes. "How did we get here, Ray?" she whispered. Outside, the wind rattled the old maple tree in the yard. The house felt achingly quiet. Later that week, Mrs. Abrams visited. She brought a casserole dish and found Helen sitting at the kitchen table, pale and distant. "What happened?" she asked, setting the dish down quickly. Helen told her everything: the canceled account, the disabled auto pay, the downgraded insurance, the pressure, the lies, the manipulation. Mrs. Abrams listened, her face tightening with every word. "That's not just greed," she said firmly. "That's a setup." Helen's voice cracked. "They want me to seem like I can't take care of myself." "They want your house," Mrs. Abrams corrected. "And they're willing to make you look unstable to get it." The words hit hard, painfully true. Something inside Helen, something quiet and old and steady, finally rose to the surface. "Not while I'm still breathing," she said, her voice shaking but resolute. Her friend nodded. "That's more like the Helen I know." Later that night, Helen opened the file the attorney had given her. She read every line, every contingency Ray had written, every safeguard he left behind. And at the bottom of the folder, she found a note in Ray's handwriting. A short one, a simple one, but enough to strengthen her resolve in a way nothing else could. "Helen, if anything ever happens and the boys forget who they are, trust the truth. It's stronger than any lie." She held the note to her chest and closed her eyes. The boys might twist things, they might manipulate, they might push and pressure, but they couldn't erase the truth Ray had left behind. The next step was clear. She knew what she had to do. Her fight was no longer emotional. It was practical, determined, grounded in facts, and she had the truth on her side. The boys, however, didn't know that yet. They still believed they were winning. They still believed they could corner her. They still believed she was weak. But they were about to be wrong. Very wrong. And the moment of justice was getting closer with every passing day. The day of the official will reading arrived with an air of tension that Helen could feel before she even stepped out of bed. She sat on the edge of the mattress for several minutes, steadying her breath. This wasn't just another meeting. This was the moment Ray had prepared her for. The moment she would finally see the truth laid out in black and white. Still, a knot tightened in her stomach. She dressed slowly, choosing a soft blue sweater Ray always liked. She brushed her thinning hair back neatly. She wanted to walk into that office with dignity, no matter what the boys intended. When she arrived, the lobby was quiet. A carpeted space with beige walls, framed certificates, and the faint smell of old books. She took a seat and folded her hands in her lap. 5 minutes passed. Then the door swung open. Mark and Daniel walked in together. Mark, wearing a tailored gray suit that made him look more important than he was. Daniel checking his watch, already impatient, already annoyed. Neither greeted her. Neither asked how she was. Neither offered a smile. Instead, Mark said, "Let's get this over with." Mr. Callahan opened the conference room door. "Helen, gentlemen, right this way." They filed in. The same long wooden table, the same chairs, the same folders neatly stacked. But this time Helen didn't feel small. She didn't feel cornered. She didn't feel confused. She felt prepared. They all sat down. Mr. Callahan cleared his throat, adjusted his glasses, and opened a large folder labeled Estate of Raymond Mitchell. "This is the formal reading," he said. "I will go through the will as written, without omission." Daniel leaned back in his chair, arms crossed as if he owned the place. Mark tapped a pen against the table, eager, confident, expectant. Mr. Callahan began. I, Raymond Mitchell, being of sound mind and conviction, leave the entirety of my estate first and foremost to my wife, Helen Mitchell, who has been my constant companion, support, and strength. Daniel's eyebrows twitched. Mark frowned but remained silent. Helen kept her eyes on the table, breathing slowly. The attorney continued, "It is my wish that she remain in our home for as long as she desires. No one is to pressure her, influence her, or manipulate her into making decisions she does not choose." Mark shifted in his chair. Daniel's jaw tightened. Helen lifted her chin slightly. The attorney went on. "In the event that any relative attempts to coerce her, interfere with her autonomy, or alter her living conditions for personal gain, the following clause is to be enacted immediately." Mark sat up straighter. "What clause?" Mr. Callahan ignored him. "All assets, including property, savings, and belongings, shall then be transferred not to the aforementioned nephews, but to the Mitchell Senior Care Foundation, a charitable program designed in Helen's honor and created to protect the elderly who face neglect or manipulation." Silence fell hard across the room. Mark's pen froze mid-tap. Daniel's mouth parted in disbelief. Helen heard the faint hum of the air conditioner. Nothing else. The attorney continued, his voice calm and steady. "This clause is binding. Any action meant to undermine Helen's independence triggers the transfer automatically. This includes, but is not limited to, pressuring her to sell the home, contacting legal services without her consent, altering her accounts, changing her policies, or attempting to damage her reputation for the purpose of financial advantage." Mark shot out of his chair. "You can't be serious." Daniel slammed a hand on the table. "This is a joke. Ray didn't write that." Mr. Callahan folded his hands. "He wrote it exactly as you heard it. He was concerned." "Concerned?" Mark spat. "About what?" "About your behavior," the attorney said. Daniel shook his head. "This is ridiculous. He must have been confused." "He was perfectly competent," the attorney interrupted, "and he saw the pattern long before Helen did." Helen sat still, her heart pounding, but her face steady. The words washed over her like a shield, like Ray was standing beside her again. Mark paced the room, running a hand through his hair. "We need to contest this. We can contest it, right?" The attorney's voice was firm. "No, you have no grounds, and any attempt to pressure Helen further will only solidify the clause." Daniel glared at Helen. "Why didn't you tell us about this?" Helen lifted her gaze to meet his. "Would it have changed anything you did?" He opened his mouth, then closed it, because they both knew the answer. "No," she said gently but clearly. "It wouldn't have." Mark slammed his palm on the table again. "This is unbelievable. Everything goes to a charity instead of staying in the family?" Mr. Callahan corrected him. "It stays with Helen," then added, without softening the blow, "because she is family." Daniel scoffed. "She's old. What does she need a house for? She can't—" "Enough," Mr. Callahan said sharply. "Your uncle's instructions are final." Helen's throat tightened. Not from fear, from something else. Relief. Ray had protected her. Even after death, he had seen her worth. He had guarded her dignity in a way the boys no longer could. Mark pointed at her, voice low and trembling with anger. "You made him do this." "No," she said softly. "You did." Daniel's face hardened. "We're not done." Helen inhaled deeply. "Yes," she said. "We are." The attorney closed the folder. "That concludes the reading." The nephews stood abruptly, gathering their things as if the room itself had betrayed them. Mark muttered, "This isn't fair." Helen finally stood too, slow but steady. "Fairness wasn't the problem," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Your choices were." Daniel refused to look at her. Mark shook his head in disbelief. For a moment, none of them moved. Then the nephews stormed out, the door slamming behind them. Helen remained still, her hand resting lightly on the back of the chair, her breath trembling with equal parts hurt and victory. "Mr. Callahan touched her shoulder gently. Ray loved you very deeply, Helen. He wanted to make sure you'd never be left unprotected." She nodded, feeling tears burn in her eyes, not from sadness, but from gratitude. When she walked out of the office into the bright afternoon sun, the air felt different, lighter, warmer, as if a long dark chapter had finally closed. For the first time in months, she didn't feel afraid. She felt free, and she felt ready, because life still held something for her beyond loss and betrayal. Ray had made sure of that. In the days that followed the will reading, Helen moved through her home with a new sense of clarity. She still felt the heaviness of what had happened. Betrayal doesn't leave quickly, but the fear was gone. For the first time in a long time, she felt protected. She felt seen. She felt chosen. Ray had left her more than an inheritance. He had left her a direction, and now it was time to follow it. 2 weeks later, Mr. Callahan called her and said, "Helen, it's time to talk about the foundation. Ray left instructions, but he intended for you to shape its heart." She hesitated. "I'm not sure what I can offer. I'm just one person." "You're the person who inspired him," he replied. Those words stayed with her the rest of the day. That afternoon she walked to the Cedar Falls church, one she hadn't visited much since Ray passed away. The doors were open, a warm light spilling onto the sidewalk. She stepped inside and took a seat in the last pew, letting the silence surround her. Memories flooded in. She and Ray volunteering at food drives, passing out blankets in winter, helping elderly neighbors repair their porch steps or fill out medical forms. Quiet acts of kindness that had woven their marriage together. Ray had known something about her she'd forgotten in her grief. She had always been someone who took care of others. Maybe it was time to begin again. She stood, walked to the front, and spoke to Pastor Williams, an older man with gentle eyes who had known her for decades. "Helen," he said warmly, "it's good to see you. We've missed you around here." "I've been lost," she said softly, "but I think I've found something I need to do." She explained the foundation, how Ray had created it, how it now belonged entirely to her, and how he had envisioned it helping seniors who were alone or neglected. Pastor Williams listened with the same patience he'd always shown. "Helen," he said, "this could change lives. Truly. Do you think I'm capable of leading something like this?" she asked. "You've been leading with your heart your whole life," he answered. "This is simply the first time you're seeing it." With the church's help, Helen began planning. She met with volunteers, with social workers, with the director of the community center, with nurses who visited seniors in their homes, with neighbors who wanted to help. A quiet spark inside her began to grow. She proposed starting small, a weekly gathering at the community center where seniors could come for warm meals, conversation, and support. Transportation would be arranged for those who couldn't drive. Volunteers would make check-in calls during the week. No one would feel forgotten. She thought of the older woman who lived alone near the corner store. She thought of Mr. Blanchard, who had lost his wife last winter. She thought of elderly veterans who had no family left. And yes, she thought of herself. People like her, people with stories, memories, scars, and worth, shouldn't be pushed aside just because the world moved fast and carelessly. The first meeting happened on a Thursday afternoon. Helen arrived early, carrying a tray of homemade cornbread, just like she used to make for Ray. She wasn't sure anyone would show up. Maybe 1 or 2 people. Maybe none at all. But when the clock reached 2 o'clock, the doors began to open. Mrs. Abrams walked in first, her cane tapping the floor rhythmically. Then Mr. Blanchard, wearing his veteran's cap. Then a married couple in their late 70s who had lost their only child years ago. Then a quiet man who lived above the pharmacy. Then more, and more, and more. By the time everyone had arrived, there were nearly 20 people gathered in the room. Helen stood near the front, her hands clasped, uncertainty fluttering in her chest. Pastor Williams whispered, "Say something." She nodded, took a deep breath, and stepped forward. "Thank you for being here," she began, her voice steady but warm. "I know how it feels to be alone. I know how it feels to be forgotten. And I know how it feels to believe that your best days are behind you." She looked around the room. So many faces, etched with years of stories.
"But I don't believe that is true anymore. Not for me. Not for any of us." Silence settled, but it wasn't heavy. It was expectant. "My husband dreamed of creating a place where people like us could feel seen, a place where no one would be left behind. That's what this foundation is for. And this gathering?" She smiled softly. "This is just the beginning." A murmur of agreement moved through the room. Someone wiped a tear. Someone nodded. Someone smiled for the first time in weeks.
For nearly 2 hours, they talked. They laughed. They shared memories. They ate cornbread and soup brought by volunteers. Helen moved from table to table, listening to their stories the way Ray used to listen to hers. And for the first time since his passing, she didn't feel alone. This wasn't just a meeting. It was the start of something real, something healing, something that carried Ray's heart and her own. When the gathering ended, several people hugged her. Some thanked her. One woman said, "You brought life back into my week. I can't remember the last time I felt this connected." Helen went home that evening, tired but full. As she stepped onto her porch, the sun was setting behind the maple tree, bathing the house in soft golden light. She looked up at the sky and whispered, "We did it, Ray." Inside, she placed the leftover cornbread in the kitchen, hung her shawl on the hook, and walked to the living room. She sat in Ray's chair, not in grief, but in peace. This house wasn't just her past. It was her anchor, her legacy, her purpose. And now, through the foundation, through the community she was building, her life was touching many others who needed exactly what she needed too. A reminder that they mattered. A reminder that their stories weren't over. A reminder that love, quiet, steady, enduring, still had work left to do. Helen was no longer fighting to survive. She was building something meant to last. And the world around her was already beginning to change. Spring arrived fully in Cedar Falls, painting the town with soft colors, pastel greens on the trees, pale blues in the sky, the golden hue of sunlight reaching through the windows of Helen's home each morning. With each passing day, the community foundation grew. More seniors joined the weekly gatherings. Volunteers signed up to help drive people to appointments. The local newspaper even wrote a small feature about the program, calling it "A Beacon of Connection for the Forgotten." Helen clipped the article and placed it in a small frame on her mantel. She didn't need recognition, but Ray would have been proud. And that thought alone warmed her like sunlight through glass. Still, life had a way of circling back. Not every door stays closed forever. One afternoon, while Helen was sweeping her porch, a black SUV pulled into her driveway. She froze for a moment, heart quickening. She knew that car. She knew it too well. Mark stepped out first, adjusting his suit jacket. Daniel followed, looking uneasy. They walked toward her slowly, like men carrying weight they had never expected to bear. For the first time in months, Helen stood straight and calm, broom in hand, not hiding, not shrinking. She wasn't the frightened woman they once cornered in a lawyer's office. She wasn't the confused elder they tried to shape into helplessness. She was herself again, and they could feel it. "Aunt Helen," Mark began, clearing his throat. "We wanted to talk." She didn't invite them inside. She didn't offer tea. She simply nodded and waited. Daniel spoke next, his voice lower than before. "We messed up." Helen kept her eyes steady, saying nothing. Mark glanced at Daniel before continuing. "We thought we were being practical, helping, doing what made sense, but the practiced tone, the same one he used in business meetings, no longer worked here." His voice cracked. "We were wrong," he said finally. "We crossed lines. We hurt you. And we're sorry." Helen felt the words settle on her shoulders, not light, not heavy, just real. She studied them quietly. These were not children anymore. These were grown men who had allowed ambition to blur their hearts. And now, they were standing in front of her, stripped of those illusions. She leaned gently on the porch railing. "Why are you here?" Daniel swallowed hard. "Because the will made everything clear. Ray knew who you were, and he knew who we had become. We were angry at first, but He was right. Mark nodded. We never meant to become those people. Helen's voice was soft but firm. But you did. Silence. Only the wind moved through the maple tree beside the porch. Mark took a breath. We're not asking for anything. Not forgiveness. Not another chance at the house. Nothing. Daniel added. We just want to make things right. Helen looked out at the yard. The same yard where they once played as boys, chasing each other barefoot in the summer grass. I loved you both, she said. More than you'll ever understand. Daniel's eyes lowered. And I'm glad, she continued, that you finally see the truth. But forgiveness is not something I can give in a day. We know, Mark said. But I can offer you this, she said. I don't hate you. And I don't want you carrying that weight for the rest of your lives. Tears welled in Daniel's eyes. But understand this as well, she added gently. My life is mine now. My home is mine. My choices are mine. And the days when you could steer me, pressure me, or shrink me into silence, those days are gone. Mark nodded, tears in his eyes, too. We understand. Helen let out a breath that felt like it had been trapped for months. That's all I needed to know. They turned to leave, but Helen spoke once more. Boys, they turned back. If one day you want to show up to help, not for money, not for the house, not for anything else, just to help, I'll be here. Mark nodded. We will. Daniel wiped his face. Thank you. They got into the car and drove away, leaving behind not reconciliation, but possibility. And sometimes, possibility is enough. That evening, Helen attended another foundation meeting. The center buzzed with soft chatter, warmth, connection. Someone had brought peach cobbler. Another brought knitted blankets to donate. People were laughing, playing cards, sharing stories. Helen moved through the room with ease, speaking with everyone, listening, encouraging. She no longer felt like a woman trying to hold on to the remnants of her life. She felt like someone building something new. As the sun set, she walked home slowly, taking the long way just to breathe in the cool evening air. She reached her porch, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. The house no longer felt like a battleground. It felt like a blessing, a sanctuary, a beginning. She walked to Ray's armchair, placed her hand on the worn fabric, and smiled softly. I'm doing it, Ray, she whispered. I'm really doing it. She didn't need the house for security anymore. She didn't need the boys' approval. She didn't need to fear the future, because she had rediscovered something far more important than all of that, herself. And in doing so, she had rebuilt a life with purpose, community, dignity, and quiet joy. When she finally sat in her favorite chair near the window, the house wrapped around her like an old embrace. A new chapter had begun, not out of anger, not out of fear, but out of choice, out of hope. And as the last light of day filtered into the room, she closed her eyes and felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time: peace.